Welcome. I'm here. My name's Cliff Freilich, the Executive Director of Cinema St. Louis, and I'm here with Matt Rice, who is the director of The Ballad of John Henry. Welcome, Matt.
Hi, thanks for introducing me.
And he's got a very appropriate background, obviously, and it looks great. You can talk a little bit more. Well, they've just seen the film, so they're actually familiar with that space. But you can talk a little bit about it as we go forward. But let's ask a very simple question initially, and that is, how did you first light on this subject and decide this would make a great movie? What sparked your interest, and how did you begin to pursue it?
Yeah, so I was already interested in historical documentary filmmaking when I was initially right out of college. I started working for Ken Burns Documentary Film Company and was really interested in archival filmmaking and trying to tell a story from the past that's still relevant today. And so while I was working with that company, I was reading lots of different books and came across Steel Driving Man, which is Scott Nelson's book on the John Henry tale and sort of his take on the true story behind it. I thought it was a really fantastic book, not only because he did such a good job of tracking the history of who this John Henry character could have really been, but also it told a very sad story of race relations in the United States and how not only was John Henry one person, but he kind of represented a much larger group, the African American community during that time and throughout. So I thought it was a fantastic book, read up on a lot more of the research behind what was presented, and that's how I got started.
And then you obviously reached out to Scott to make certain that he would be interested in participating in it. So talk a little bit about that whole process, how you go about making an historical documentary. People, I think, have a good sense of how you go about making a contemporary doc. You go out and shoot. On the other hand, you have to do a lot of additional research and find the materials that are going to make up your film. So talk a little bit about that full process. And take us from the beginning when you made contact with Scott, and then how you went about gathering all the material that you're going to use.
Yeah, and you're totally right. So doing a historical documentary is a little bit different than doing sort of like a documentary that's more relevant or current. And I think the biggest thing for me, luckily I was exposed to it when I was working on a few other projects, but basically I spent about a year just doing research. So I first wanted to know everything I could about what Scott Nelson had done in his research, but also all of the other researchers that had worked on this project. See who else is out there, who else I could potentially interview and include in the film. So it took about a year to do all of that, and I wanted to make sure before reaching out and kind of not wasting Scott Nelson's time, but asking him to participate. I wanted to know that this could be a good film. But it was really, really awesome. About a year later, I reached out and I just said, hey, I'm really into this topic. I know you wrote this book. Would you be willing to sit down and interview with me? And he was more than willing. And Sherman James, who from Duke University, I reached out to him and he was willing as well. So it was really pretty amazing to kind of reach out and get their sort of buy-in, so to speak, in terms of willing to sit down and interview. And our interviews didn't last very long. They were about an hour of their time, but it was just so cool to be a part of that and have their trust to allow me to work on the film. I was very transparent in the beginning. This was my first documentary film I was producing, like feature length. So I was very transparent from the beginning that, this could be a hour and a half long film. At the time, that's what I was thinking, or it could be a 20-minute film. I don't know. But they were more than willing to sit down and spend an hour on a Saturday interviewing with me, which was really kind of them.
So that gave you sort of the baseline. You had the contemporary interviews with experts, historians who could give you insight into the story, but you still had to gather all the visual materials. You can't just have people talk. We're doing that here, but most people aren't going to sit still for that if they're watching a documentary. You need to find the archival material that was going to support it. So where did you turn? How did you go about gathering that material?
Yeah, another great question, because that was probably my biggest challenge. It's talked about, I think, at least in one of the interviews. I mean, the people that we were discussing in the film, the railroad workers, they were kind of a forgotten group of people, mainly because a lot of them didn't know how to read and write. There was not a lot of photographs taken of them at that time. Railroad, the railroad industry was like, really big deal. The way it was sort of described to me is it's kind of like our SpaceX programs today. Like this was the technology, the pinnacle of technology at that time. So they did want to document, tunnel construction and railroad construction, but they weren't too concerned about covering the workers and their experience. So I had very limited resources. I had experimented with like building miniature sets. A few of those show up in the film, but those didn't turn out as well as I'd hoped. So then I looked into finding whatever photographs I could find. And ultimately, so this honestly took me about 3 years to kind of gather all this material and put it together. But towards the end of that, I honestly just went out to different archives, following kind of in the footsteps of Scott, where he had gone and found certain documents that he considered to be like the best evidence proving that this is the true John Henry. And then I found photographs within those archives. And that was a really cool experience because, again, I was entrusted by these archives. Being a first-time filmmaker, they just allowed me to go in and kind of handle these really, really old documents and kind of look through them. So that was a really neat experience. And ultimately, the majority of the visuals were gathered in probably the last year of production.
So, obviously you were an intern with Ken Burns, and Ken Burns obviously also casts a very long shadow over anybody who's going to make an historical documentary in the US nowadays.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm curious as to, I'm sure it was great having that experience with Burns, and I'd like you to talk a little bit about what specifically you did for him and what you gathered from that experience. But also, how do you escape that shadow? How do you make a film that feels like yours and is just not sort of emulating how Ken Burns would take the same approach to the story?
Yeah, I took a lot of inspiration from their production process. So as an intern, I was able to kind of sit in on, at the time they were working on the Vietnam War. So I was working with the apprentice editors, helping put together interview footage, helping to organize different archival photos that were coming in. They just kept coming in every day. But basically the best part of that experience was I got to see how the story was created. And it's, literally taking transcripts of interviews and just picking it apart, building scripts, building the story first, like as a radio play. So they used a lot of the audio and no visuals. And then ultimately started laying in a lot of the archival footage. So that was a really important process for me to see how they do it, knowing that it takes that amount of time and effort to make something like that. And then kind of breaking away from that mold, I'm a huge fan of Ken Burns films. I grew up throughout grade school and high school watching Civil War and all of his other documentary series. So I've always loved watching them. I wanted to potentially make a film, though, a historical film that was a little bit more to the point and shorter, a little more concise. And so my goal for this film was to make it quick edits, make it more of a mystery, sort of adding in elements of questions and answers and finding out, different pieces of evidence. So that was my take on it. I did add in a lot of Ken Burn tropes, I guess you could say, like definitely a lot of archival photo push-ins, and I love the way he uses letters to tell stories, and voice actors reading those letters. So I did incorporate those elements as well. But really, for me, it was just trying to make history more exciting for a younger audience, and that was my goal. And ultimately, I would love to share it with schools, high schools, libraries, wherever it can be seen to help educate students.
Now, obviously, you did all of this on your own. Essentially, you were didn't have. I assume you didn't have any sort of institutional support, and so you were traveling across the country to these archives to film the interviews, etc. Spending your own money, I'm presuming, with the hope that you were going to have a film at the end of it that you could potentially get out into the world and perhaps get back a little bit of what it is you spent. So, talk a little bit about that, the decision making as to, can I afford to do this? How much you were prepared to spend, so to speak, on your own, whether or not you did seek out grants and support from other places. Just talk a little bit about that aspect of making a documentary.
Sure. Yeah. So I originally did seek out some grants. I never actually applied for them, but I was looking to see what kind of funding was available and out there. And there are a surprising amount of foundations and grants willing to fund something like this. My biggest fear, though, was that I would lose sort of my voice through that process, and would spend too much time on the funding side and not enough time on the creation production side of things. Another thing that I really enjoyed about this film process, for me, it was very slow, and a big reason for that was that I would raise enough money, go out and shoot something, run out of money, and then I'd have to raise more. So I wasn't really looking at it as I have to hit a certain budget, but I was trying to do it by whatever means I could, and still make it look like much larger production than it actually was. So towards the end, I knew I had to travel to so many different archives, visit a lot of different locations, and I was having a hard time figuring out how to travel. And I got to the point where I just thought, you know what, I'm gonna get a camper van, go cross country, and just let myself go to each archive and kind of search it out that way. So yeah, I guess that's the best way to put it. I was just willing to do whatever I could to get it finished. It took me about 5 years to wrap it up. And to be perfectly frank, I gave up on it probably 3 or 4 times during that process, because you would lose money, and then think, well, there's nowhere else I can go to make this happen. But something, it just kept nagging at me. I got to finish this project. So I'd raise a few more bucks and go back out and try and wrap it up.
Well, we're happy you did.
Thanks.
What do you do, by the way, to earn a living while you were making the film?
Yeah. So luckily I'm a videographer. So I went to film school and learned how to do documentary film production. And then right out of film school, I worked mostly in marketing. So I would do a lot of commercial shoots, a lot of the, some of the documentaries I did, like shorter documentaries for nonprofits that I really enjoyed doing. And it was interesting because in film school, I was taught how to make big budget films, so $1 million productions. And as soon as you got out of college, you quickly realize that you don't have that funding at your fingertips until you become someone. So it's been I've been out of school now for about 10 years, and it's been a great kind of journey, because I'm kind of learning how to do everything either on my own or with a smaller crew. So again, this production was such a good education for me, because I figured out, this is how I can do it with what I got. And it gives me the confidence now to go off and pursue other film projects like it. So hopefully we can leapfrog from one to the next.
Right. Well, let's talk a little bit about the film itself, of course, as well. Even though it's an historical documentary, I think it really speaks to the current moment. It couldn't be more timely on some levels. The way in which you framed like the convict lease program as sort of a continuation of slavery, just under a different name. that legacy, and then of course the Jim Crow era, et cetera, and the way in which it all contributes to the current moment is very much, I think, evident in the film. And you address contemporary issues, even though you're looking at things from an historical lens. Was that very much on your mind, that you wanted to make it a film that spoke to today as much as yesterday?
Yes, absolutely. And like I said before, the book itself did a really good job of explaining that process. And the more people I talked to, they just kept explaining that, this was sort of a microcosm, this story, the John Henry story, that this was going on all across the South at the time. So it was, to me, it was, and to everyone else, John Henry is sort of this catch-all personality. Everyone can find themselves in him in some way, which was really fascinating. Those who knew the story, I guess. So yeah, John Henry kind of embodied more than just a man. And I thought that was really important to explain why he embodies, more than just that moment where he beats the steel, the steam drill. So I definitely wanted to focus on that, and I thought it was very relevant to today. So yeah.
And you talk a little bit about other issues that wouldn't have necessarily come to mind in most, if most folks were thinking of how you tell the story of John Henry, like the hypertension, that aspect. How did that end up coming to the fore, and how did you stumble across that aspect?
Yeah. So the hypertension aspect was included in the book, just explaining how John Henry could have possibly died immediately after that competition. Why would he have choked and fallen over? But again, that is something that was occurring in penitentiaries using the convict lease system all across the country, that they didn't understand, or at least they didn't have the research behind the fact that all these people, these workers were dying for a very specific reason, and that would be consumption, which was sort of a catch-all term for any lung disease or something along those lines. But it was really amazing going into the records, the penitentiary records, and finding that, yes, as the years progressed and as the convict lease program became more popular, more and more prisoners were dying in these work programs. And the main reason was consumption. You could just see the numbers increase over time. So it was pretty amazing that the records were still available, that we had access to them, and it very clearly showed that something was awry. So I thought that was a really important thing to focus on, because I think back then it was an important topic, and even today it's still unfortunately occurring.
Another aspect of the film you touch on, but you don't necessarily explore in depth, but that could have led to an entirely different film, and that's the song itself and the way in which it evolves over time, and sort of taking an approach from a folkloric perspective, which you do periodically. But I'm just curious, was that a temptation at all to actually explore that aspect in still more depth?
It was, yeah. So this is where I ran into funding issues. I really wish I could have shared more about the song and some of the different interpretations. There are a lot of really great blues musicians and country musicians who've covered John Henry. And to anyone who watches this, I highly recommend going out and just listening to a few. They're all online. But unfortunately, the rights were very expensive to obtain, and I just couldn't make that work. So luckily, Jimmy Costa, who's in the film, was kind enough. He's an amazing folk musician living in Talcott, which is my background. So he does a lot of sort of live events at the tunnel and then at the museum there. And he was kind enough to kind of give me a few of the interpretations of the song. The lyrics change, which is also really fascinating. And as the lyrics change, it tells you of a different time and era. But just really, really loved the song and wish I could have added more. I think some of the best feedback I've gotten from a lot of people is that they love the fact that it was kind of the start of rock and roll and how that had those elements tie in. So I thought that was cool.
Once you get a little more funding, you have a sequel ahead of yourself.
Yeah. That'd be nice.
Oh, I'm sure you actually probably want to move on to a different subject at this point too. So let's wrap things up by asking whether or not you have in mind something that you're planning on pursuing or that you perhaps have already begun to pursue.
So I started research on another folklore hero, Paul Bunyan, and was really fascinated by how the advertising campaign created around Paul Bunyan and his stories had changed the forestation or the forests of Wisconsin, that it allowed a lot of lumber companies to go in and just basically mow down these ancient forests and trees. So I did do a lot of research on that and was starting to plan for that, but unfortunately COVID has kind of delayed that process. And in the interim, I have found another project that I'm kind of pursuing that's a little bit more current, which is following several businesses in St. Louis and how they've been affected by the pandemic and sort of their changes in business strategies and the stay-at-home orders and quarantining. So that's kind of the current project I'm working on, but I'm very excited to pick up Paul Bunyan again when things kind of die down.
Well, perhaps we'll see the COVID project at next year's St. Louis Filmmaker Showcase.
Yeah, that'd be great.
All right, Matt, thank you so much for your participation, and good luck as you take the Ballad of John Henry and try and get it out into the world.
Thank you so much, Cliff.
All right.